We are just over, in fact, we are about one paragraph over halfway done with our series, On the Road Again. When we finished last week, we had finished the first three. There's going to be three more, counting today. We're following Jesus all the way from Caesarea Philippi, which is like 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. We're following him all the way to Jerusalem. And we're picking out passages where we can see the things that were valuable to Jesus, that were on his mind as he knew he was going to Jerusalem to be hailed as king in the triumphal entry and to be crucified less than a week later. We've talked about that transition from his public ministry and how he shifted to a more private ministry among his disciples. We talked about his compassion as we looked at the Good Samaritan parable. We've talked about prayer. Today, I want to introduce the concept of being all in. We're going to look at the cost of discipleship. And two things that all of us should have considered before we began to follow Jesus. Now, some of you may not be aware that that phrase, all in, is actually a card-playing phrase. It's used by people who play cards, primarily card games that involve poker chips. Now, I'm not advocating gambling this morning. Please understand, I do not gamble. I don't have the cool or the presence of mind to gamble, but I do enjoy card games. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Tripoli is one of those games where rather than keeping score on a paper, you use poker chips to keep score. And I play those kind of games with people every once in a while, and I fancy myself to be a reasonably good card player, but I frequently get reminded that I may not be as good as I think I am. Point being, at some point when you play these games that involve these chips as your scorekeeping, there comes a point in time where the player realizes either they're looking at the table or in the cards that have already been played, or they're looking at their own hand and they're realizing, I'm going to win this one. I've got this one. And so they push all their chips in the middle and they risk it all. They're all in. Or maybe they look at the cards in their hand and the cards that have already been played, and they look at the way their opponent is behaving and they say, they don't know if they can win or not. I'll try to bluff them by going all in. I tried that one time. I was playing with someone. We were just playing a game where we were using the chips for points. And I knew that my opponent didn't know whether or not that they could win the hand or not. So I said, I'm just going to take this one. And I pushed all my chips in. I didn't even have a good high card. But I just pushed all my chips in and said, all in, and tried to bluff them into folding. My opponent looked right back at me and said, Mike, that only works if there's something to lose. And pushed all their chips in the middle, and I lost everything. That's the key concept to all in. There's a risk involved. There's something there that you might lose, or there might be some damage to being all in. And in our culture, we are advised against that. We're conditioned against that. We've all heard the saying, look before you leap. We've all had someone tell us at some point in time, don't put all your eggs in one basket. We've all had somebody tell us at some point in time, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. We're conditioned to be cautious, to keep just a little bit back and not be all in. Yet in the passage that was read for us this morning, Jesus is calling us to be all in, to be totally committed. Now, as we start this, we have to recognize that Jesus is, at this point, probably about halfway between Caesarea Philippi and Jerusalem, and the crowds are starting to get bigger. He's back into the part of the world where there are a lot of Jews, and they've heard about him, and they've heard that he's very entertaining. He does miracles. He's a very eloquent speaker. Let's go see what's going on. And a lot of people are gathering. And Jesus turns to the crowd, And in verse 25, Luke says, "Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brother and sister, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple.'" Those are strong words. Jesus has this tendency to not pull his punches. But from our 21st century perspective, I wonder if we really understand just how strong these words are. If you do not hate your mother and father, that's more than just dislike. That actually, in the language of the day, it's actually more devalue. It's not quite disrespect, but it could be. But it is definitely to bring their value down, to not see as quite as important as we saw before. And in their culture, that's the kind of language that can get you stoned. I don't think there's anybody in here that'll misunderstand that word. Stoned? Some of you will get it later. No, literally, one of the 10 commandments, the 5th commandment, is honor your mother and your father. And if you don't, mom and dad can go to the elders of the village and say he's disrespectful and he's dishonoring and he's unruly, and they can have him stoned to death. Jesus takes that well-known fact to them and says, if you don't hate your mother and your father, your wife, your kids, your brother and sister, you can't be my disciple. You can't do it. He goes even further. He says, even your own life. I don't know why they translated that way. The word life there is not the expected word for life. It's the word suke. We usually translate that word soul. Even your own soul. In the Greek world, that word would mean something about the animal form of life. You know, more animated than a tree, but not quite human. It's the more functional aspect of the person's life. It would be something we would call our hopes and our dreams, our ambitions. If we don't hate those. Now, obviously, Jesus is using a hyperbole here. But sometimes I think we hide behind that fact to weaken this statement too much. Because notice what else he says about hating yourself. Take up your cross. Not only did taking up your cross mean that you were probably not going to have another day, it meant that you were probably on your way to die. But it was a humiliating way to die. We have a tendency to dress Jesus in our crucifixes in very honorable ways, but they didn't do that in the first century. They did everything they could to humiliate somebody who was on a cross. And don't forget, Jesus knows that in just a few days, he's going to enter Jerusalem to cheers of people who just a day or two after that are going to ask for his crucifixion. He's telling them, this is where I'm going. Don't come with me if you're not willing to pay that price. Don't come to Jerusalem. Don't come looking for a show. Don't come looking for an eloquent speech. Don't look for miracles. Where I'm going, it's not going to be pleasant. He's already predicted that to his disciples. I'll be mistreated, I'll be killed, and I'll rise on the third day. Been saying that the whole trip. We call this part of the gospel message the cost of discipleship, where Jesus is being very honest with us. You don't get to play this game for free. Following Jesus is going to cost something. And he goes on from that point to illustrate the seriousness of that cost. He tells them in 2 short stories that they should not make a hasty decision to follow him. Verse 28 says, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see will begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" Don't follow Jesus unless you're going to be all in, because eventually that will embarrass you. That's the traditional way of teaching those verses. But remember what Jesus is going to do. He's going to Jerusalem. He's going to die. Just days after being proclaimed king. That's what happened on Good Friday. In the triumphal entry, the people said, "If you want to be our king, we're ready to storm the castle. We're ready to drive out the Romans, and you be our king, we'll do that." And in a few days, it becomes obvious that he's not going to do that, and they accuse him of being a failed Messiah and turn him over to the Romans to be crucified. He's predicting here, people are going to call me a failure. And those people who follow me are going to be called a failure. If you're not all in, don't follow me. Even more, verse 31 says, "Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace." This is a picture of one king who's being invaded by another king, and the army that's coming is overwhelming. And he sends out his emissaries basically to surrender. To say, "I can't win anyway. Let's cut our losses and just quit." Those who were listening and understood Jesus saying, "I'm on my way to Jerusalem. You need to get out while you can." Because in just a few days, or just a few days after entering Jerusalem, many of his followers will be hiding behind locked doors, planning to sneak out of town when nobody can see, because they're afraid they're going to end up crucified too. Jesus is saying, don't make a hasty decision to follow me. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pleasant. And then Jesus says something that I consider one of the most terrifying things Jesus has ever said. I think what Jesus says next should keep some Christians up at night. I don't think we really let the ramifications of what Jesus is about to say to us sink in. Verse 33, Jesus says this, "So therefore, anyone who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has an ear, let him hear." Now, I was going to try to soften this up. I was going to try to make this palatable because it's pretty harsh language. But I went and looked it up. It's a little insight into how you prepare a message. When you don't know how to say something, you look and see how other people have said it. So I went to my commentaries to see how other people would communicate this. And in my three favorite commentaries, the ones that I use the most, all three of them used the word worthless. If salt loses its saltiness, it's worthless. It has no value. And if a disciple loses their commitment, they're worthless. If a follower of Jesus Christ is not totally committed, not all in, they're worthless. Not my words, folks. Jesus' words. It's awfully quiet in here. Did any of us consider that when we began to follow Jesus? Did any of us? I mean, just speaking for myself here, I didn't know that. I never thought of it that deeply when I began to follow Jesus. But since then, I've become to realize that nobody really can follow Jesus that way. When Jesus made this speech to the crowd on the road on his way to Jerusalem, he already knew that he was going to be crucified. But more than that, he knew nobody was going to stand up to Pilate and say, if you crucify him, you got to crucify me too. Nobody said, I'm so committed to Jesus that I'm not going to let you crucify him without crucifying me too. Nobody picked up a cross and followed Jesus down the Via Dolorosa. In fact, there were only 3 people that we know of that had ever followed Jesus that was in the crowd when he was crucified. John, the apostle, his mother, and Mary Magdalene. There may have been some other ladies there, but the guys sure weren't going to show up. They were looking for a way out of town without getting caught. Nobody was all in. And really, can we be? We live in a world where we have to face reality, and each one of us comes to Jesus with a certain amount of sin in our life. The Bible says all of us have sinned and fallen short of his glory. None of us are perfect. We all have a weight of guilt that holds us down. We all have the pressure of society that drags us away. We all have the basic financial responsibilities that sometimes tempt us to behave somewhat differently than Jesus would have. Or our family members that take away our holiness when we have to interact with them. We're all there. Nobody is really all in. That just means that all of us are dependent on his grace. See, Jesus knew he was setting that standard so high. Jesus knew that when he went to the cross, nobody would follow. But Jesus also knew 3 days later he was going to rise from the dead. And when he did, some of them would remember the speech and realize their dependence on his grace. Now, the vast majority of us in this room, I think everybody I look at in this room has probably heard the gospel of grace. Probably knows that we need to accept Jesus' grace for our salvation. Every sin that we've ever committed, every thought, word, and deed that violates God's law. We talked about that in one of the Sunday school classes this morning. Have you ever told a lie? Have you ever stolen something, even something small? Have you ever misused God's name? Have you ever looked at somebody of the opposite gender and said, wish I had some of that? None of us would say we could come to God without his grace. We've all violated his law. We all have a penalty to pay that's more than we can pay. And we all know that Jesus went to that cross to pay that penalty and to become our Savior from the penalty our sin deserves. But we have to be reminded, sometimes we forget, that we also have to depend on His grace for our sanctification. And that's one of those $50 words that needs a little explanation, okay? Sanctification is nothing more than being all in for Jesus. The technical definition of sanctification is to be totally set apart from one thing to another. In the Bible, it's always set apart from the world and our sin to God and righteousness. But we still live in a real world. And none of us is ever totally righteous. And we need to rely on Jesus' grace just as much for our growth as for our salvation. Just as Jesus is the Savior from the penalty of our sin, Jesus is the sanctifier from the punishment of our sin. From the power of our sin. The power that it has over us. And as we consistently follow Him and are more and more all in with Him, the more His sanctification plays out in our life. And we become more committed to Him. We really do have to be all in with Jesus. We can't depend on our own strength. We can't depend on our own wisdom. We can't depend on ourselves for anything. Jesus is the only one who's perfect. Just as a card player can't win the game if he's not willing to go all in at some point in that game to risk it all, we can't win with Jesus unless we're ever more all in to what He calls us to. Unless we're consistently more committed to being His disciple. So, I leave you in an uncomfortable position for the week. Are you all in? That's what you get to think about this week. Am I really all in, fully dependent on the grace of Jesus Christ, not just for some day at judgment down the road, but for how I live my life every day of the week? Do you trust Him that much? Will you let Him lead you that much? Will you be open to the family challenges and the social shame sometimes, the criticism that might come? To let Jesus' grace cause you to grow.